released a new report today on rethinking workforce and training and adjustment programs for a era that we can expect to be more disruptive from the labor market in terms of emerging technologies. We're really pleased to have a great panel of respondents today. I will present some of the major findings and recommendations from the report, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists, who should have at least 15 minutes for questions and comments from you all. I'll go in the order from my right to the left. Ed Alden is a Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and where he focuses on economic competitiveness. He is the author of a great book. If you haven't read it, it's about maybe a year and a half, 2 years old now. A year and a half, called Failure to Adjust: How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. Excuse me. And relevant to this event today, he has at least one, if not two chapters focusing on this question of how do we do a better job of helping workers who are hurt, whether it's by globalization or technology. He also directs the CFR Renewing American publication series and is the author of many, many different reports. Steve DeWitt is the Deputy Executive Director for the Association for Career and Technical Education. The work of ACTE is to promote career and technical education around the nation, and his members span a wide variety of kinds of educational institutions with a key focus on technical education. Susan Lund is a partner at McKinsey & Company and a leader at McKinsey Global Institute. You probably haven't read an article about workforce and automation and new technologies without seeing a cite to McKinsey Global Institute works, but Susan worked in particular. She's been involved in a wide array of really fascinating reports that we find of incredible value looking at these questions, including research on labor markets and global economic growth. She's published in a number of prestigious publications: Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and others. She's also on the board of the National Association of Business Economists. And on my far left is David Ross. David is the CEO of P21, the Partnership for 21st Century Learning, which is an organization based in Washington that focuses on, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this whole concept of 21st century skills, which I think is one of the emerging areas that we have to focus a lot more on. These kinds of skills that employers are working on or looking for, but we may not be doing the best job in inculcating them. David was also CEO and founder of the Learner Group, an educational consulting group, and he's also a key player in the project-based learning movement. So let me get started. It's hard not to read articles in the Post, in Wired Magazine, and in a wide variety of places that all sort of start with the premise that we're poised for a techno-employment apocalypse. You could argue we're in the midst of a full-fledged techno-panic. We're all going to lose our jobs, even think tanks, even lawyers, even doctors. Everybody will be out of work. My favorite was a recent pundit from Silicon Valley who was with the Singularity University, if you know those folks, who recently wrote that in 5 years we'll lose 85 to 90% of all U.S. jobs. I bet him, I tried to bet him on the Long Now Foundation to say I don't agree with you, but for some reason, I don't know why, he wouldn't bet me. He said, well, it may not happen in 5 years. What I really like about this is that these fears really sound like they're new, but let me read you one from a leading AI scientist, Niels Nielsen, who says, we must convince our leaders that they should give up on the notion of full employment. The pace of technical change is accelerating. Nielsen, who, by the way, is still a prominent AI scientist, thankfully probably for his AI programming, but not his technological forecasting, wrote that in 1982. I ran across a book just last week called The Automation Panic, written in 1965, which everything in that book you can read today. The pace of technological change is accelerating. We need universal basic income. We're not going to have enough jobs, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't true then. It's not true today. What is true today is that, I would argue, we are going to face a period, and actually shouldn't face, I should say we should enjoy a period, hopefully coming sooner rather than later, where the pace of technological change in terms of automation and productivity will grow somewhat. The last 10 years have been the slowest rate of U.S. productivity growth, probably since the founding of the Republic. It's unprecedented stagnation of U.S. productivity growth. You want to know why wages haven't gone up? Because productivity is anemic. U.S. manufacturing productivity, for example, in the last 5 years has grown 1%. That's never ever happened in American history before. So we desperately need higher productivity, and it looks like this new suite of technologies, grounded in technologies like machine learning, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, robotics, blockchain, Internet of Things, that these technologies appear to be emerging, they appear to be getting cheaper, they appear to be getting better, and hopefully they will emerge to the point where they can start to drive macroeconomic numbers. They aren't doing that yet. To paraphrase Robert Solow in the 1980s, we see AI everywhere but in the productivity statistics. But I think it'll happen, and the question then is, what do we do about it? If you look at, I think, the objective studies, the balanced studies, the non-hysterical studies on employment impacts, they all basically come out at about the same number. About 15% of jobs will be automated from new technologies in the next 15 years. McKinsey Global Institute just came out with a study. The media, every single story said 30%. Because McKinsey had a range of 5 to 30, but their midpoint, their expected point was 15. The OECD's number, 15. ITIF's number, 15. So I think when we look at this, we shouldn't engage in sort of this mass panic, everybody's going to lose their jobs. But at the same time, doing nothing and just sort of putting our head in the sand and saying, well, you know, workers are going to lose their jobs, there won't be, won't be tens of millions of them, but we don't have to do anything. I think that would be a big mistake. The reason that's a big mistake is that we're already seeing disturbing signs of what I would call techno-Ludditism. When somebody is well known and is famous in the technology sector, like Bill Gates, or Robert Shiller, an economist at Yale, can come out in all seriousness and say we should tax robots because we want to slow the pace of automation down, you know that something's seriously wrong. We would want to slow the pace of automation down because it's already the slowest it's ever been in American history. We want to slow it down even more. Or when San Francisco passes a law that essentially bans delivery robots. How many people here in DC have seen the little pizza delivery robots going down? Yeah. Well, thankfully we live in the enlightened republic of the District of Columbia and not in San Francisco. By the way, the major company in the world that produces those things, you know where they're located? San Francisco. Yeah. They employ a large share of low-income, relatively unskilled workers, and they're training them on robotics technology. But the city essentially says you can't deploy those robots, if you will, here. So I think one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for these fears, these policy calls to slow this process down, is because we frankly have a pretty weak and underfunded and not very innovative workforce adjustment system in the United States. I was talking to a Swedish labor union leader a couple of years ago, and I asked him, I said, how come the Swedish labor unions have a more forward-looking approach to automation than the US unions do? And he said, well, in Sweden, the labor unions don't fear new technology, we fear old technology. I said, what do you mean? Because we fear that our companies, where we have unionized workers, that the management won't install new technologies and therefore they will just go out of business and lose all the jobs. So why does Sweden have that? Why do they have that, if you will, enlightened approach that says we want to put the pedal to the metal to innovation and automation? The reason is because they have one of the best systems in the world to help their workers adjust. They have embraced a system they call flex security. In other words, flexibility with security. Not that the government is going to have you hold on and keep your job for life, but the government and companies will make a commitment to help you transition. When you look around the world at best-in-class programs and systems, it can be both exhilarating and depressing. I think everybody who's in this space should look at Singapore's Skills Future program, which we think is the best in the world. They have made a major commitment in the last 3 years to workforce development, skill development and workforce transition. It's linked to employers and markets, very flexible. So for example, Singapore workers get training vouchers that they can use to go and go to any available training provider. It's much less bureaucratic than the US systems, and it's based upon fairly serious, bold reforms, not just tinkering around the edge when you reauthorize the bill. So what do we need to do? I think we need to do 2 big things in the US. One, we do need to invest more. The US right now spends 0.01% of GDP in active labor market programs. Active labor market programs are those programs that, rather than help workers just with income support, help them get into a new job or occupation. 0.1%, that's down by half over the last 30 years. And you compare that to our OECD competitors across the OECD as a whole, they invest 6 times more than we do. So it's not sort of surprising in a way that a lot of people look at this and they go, I just want to hold on. I want to stop changing. Because if you lose your job in the US from technology or trade, you basically are more or less on your own. So what do we need to do? I would argue in this part we need to do 4 big things. One is support full employment. It doesn't matter how many job training programs you go through. If there aren't enough jobs, it's not going to work. And importantly, regionally, there's, I think, a very dangerous view that many economists have inculcated and perpetuated with policymakers in the US that workers should just move to where the jobs are. That's easy for them because they're college-educated graduates who moved when they were 18 years old and probably moved 5 times in their life. There's a wonderful book by a British political scientist and political advisor called The Road to Nowhere. And what it does is it compares somewheres to nowheres. Nowheres are people like us, probably. They don't belong anywhere. I mean, I've lived 6 places in my life, 7. We move around, we have professional networks, we probably know more people overseas than we do in our hometown. Nowheres are people, somewheres are people who are grounded and rooted in the community they grew up in. They have friends, they have family, they have extended networks. And asking those folks to just get up and take a new job that probably won't be any better than what they have, I think is naive and it's not respectful. So I think that means we've got to do a much better job of regional economic development. In particular, and I won't go into details here, we need to think about supporting growth poles. Our current economic development efforts are basically to give little dabs of money to every little community that comes in with an application. The vast majority of those communities will never have self-sustaining economic growth. The way the economy works today, you have to have some critical mass and some scale. It doesn't mean you have to be Boston or Washington, but you can't be a little town of maybe 5 or 10,000 people. It just won't work. So we could support growth poles where people could commute to. Great thing about that, in DC, if I commute for an hour, I get 8 miles. If I commute for an hour in Alabama or in Iowa, I can get 45 or 50 miles. So labor markets are big. The second big thing is we need to do a better job of giving workers the kinds of transferable and generic skills before they get laid off. Afterwards, it's hard to do. But if you can give workers better skills before they get laid off, they're in a better position. There's a lot to be done here, and I won't go through all the details, but the reason we don't is because we have built a system that essentially was created in the early 1900s and has never changed. For example, in the United States today, 87% of high school kids take geometry, 7.7% take statistics. I guarantee you, when you go and talk to employers, any employer in the country, and ask them which is more important for you, geometry or statistics, they will say statistics. That's not to say that a few occupations, maybe carpentry or something else, geometry is useful. But statistics is one of those skills that's going to be a generic skill for many, many occupations going forward. We don't even bother to teach it. Why don't we teach it? Because we don't. Because we have requirements built in and baked into the system that say, y'all remember that from high school, algebra, geometry, and then I took this thing called trigonometry, which I have no clue what it was. And none of my friends who also took trig remember any of it. It's something to do with cosines, that's all I know. So we need to think about really redoing the curriculum. Why do we focus on literature instead of business and technical writing? Why not argumentation instead of the other? So we need to do a bunch of different things. The high school career academies are one innovation. Corporate partnerships with high schools are another. For example, IBM has their pathways in technology in early college high school they've established in New York City. We also need to do the same thing in college. There's a sort of sacred cow in the United States that says somehow that it's, if you take liberal arts, in and of itself, that is valuable. And I really want to take exception to that. I think we could be doing a much better job of moving our colleges much more towards technical education. I look at a place like University of Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, where about 15 years ago the business community realized they were not getting the kinds of workers they needed, who had the technical skills they needed. They were getting college graduates applying, but they didn't have the skills. So they created a new private university, not very expensive, focused on responding to the needs of employers in science and technology fields. For example, they have degrees in areas like analytics, geospatial technology, and interactive media. So we could do a lot more there. One of the big challenges in the U.S. is we fund four-year liberal arts colleges at a much higher level per student than we do technical colleges. I don't see why we do that. I know why we do it. I don't think it makes any sense to bias the system that way. We should allow more support for occupational credentials and short-term courses. A lot of what students need today are not a 2 or 4 year degree. Sometimes it's much shorter than that. There's a Senate bill, Jobs Act S-206, sponsored by Senator Kaine and Senator Portman, that would allow Pell Grants to be given for short-term occupational credentials. This is long overdue. Again, we should be agnostic as to how students are learning, not force them into a particular institutional model. We have a fantastic program in the U.S. that was set up in the 1980s, but is still seen as a four-step sister at NSF, called the Advanced Technical Education Program, the ATE. ATE is a fantastic program, but it only gets around $50 million a year. It's very small. And what it does is it funds community colleges around the country to focus on developing curriculum and other teaching materials in advanced technologies, and then working with community colleges all around the country to help them develop programs and curricula in these areas. For example, nanotechnology, microelectronics, MEMS, microelectronics, miniature technology, rapid prototyping, biomanufacturing, alternative fuel vehicles. These are really important areas of the future, and yet we don't do very much on them. Industry skills alliances. A lot of the problems with some of the training programs we have is they're not deeply integrated with what industry is doing, what industry needs, or how to train with industry. We've had this long view that the workforce boards around the country are going to do this naturally. In our experience, they're not. You have some that do it, you have most that don't. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act in 2015 mandated that state and local boards, quote, promote the use of industry and sector partnerships. You can encourage them to promote them, but it's harder to, you can lead the horse to water, but it's hard to make the horse drink. I think there's a bill, the investments in community technical education, community college to career fund, S620, by Senator Duckworth from Illinois, would amend the WEO Act to have DOL award competitive grants directly to educational institutions that work in partnership with industry. We need a stream of money, I would argue, that encourages and supports industry collaborations on skill development. We don't really have that. We have this sort of bank shot where we go through boards. Sometimes it works, oftentimes it doesn't work. I won't go into all the details, but apprenticeship, you look at what the Germans and the Austrians do, which is really world class on apprenticeship. They have a fantastic system because it is a system. The Trump administration issued an executive order last year to move forward on that. Their new budget supports that. I think we need to double down on that and keep going. So just a few other things, and then I'll wrap up. At a broader level, I think it's important to, a bolder, broader move would be to expand the TAA program, which is the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. It was a program set up in the 60s on the recognition that if the U.S. engages more in trade, we need to do more to help workers who are hurt by that. From a logic perspective, there really is no real reason why we should single out trade and not technology. So expanding the TAA assistance to include technological layoffs, I think would be an important next step. It's also not to say there shouldn't be reforms in TAA. I think one of the problems with TAA is encouraging workers to stay out of the labor force too long. But to me, those are reforms that could easily be implemented. We need to do a better job of providing transition assistance to workers who do lose their jobs. When you've lost your job, it's one of the best times to get retraining. You don't have anything else to do. You are aware that there's a critical need for you to get better skills or different skills, and so the timing and the motivation aligns quite well. There's one big problem, though. In the United States, even though Congress mandated that every single state, which, as you all know, states run the unemployment insurance system, mandates that every single state has to make eligible a worker who says they're in approved training, has to give them unemployment insurance for 26 weeks. The number of states that actively support that is probably 0. So states are mandated to do that, but they go out of their way to not do it. And the reason they go out of their way to not do it is because their incentives are all in line in one direction. Get that worker back in the labor force as soon as possible, because then their overall UI tax rate goes down or doesn't go up. It makes them look better from a business climate perspective. It's penny wise and pound foolish, and I think it's a huge mistake. And I think one of the things the federal government should do is to require states that when you get unemployed, that you get a formal notice that says you are eligible for training, eligible for unemployment insurance if you're in certified training. There was a study on that showed that when an experimental study, some workers got the letter, some workers didn't. It showed that 40% of workers who got the letter more enrolled in training. So I think that's a very, very important step we can take. And yes, it will raise costs a slight amount, but it will give workers much better skills so that when they go to their next employer, they're more productive and obviously work with themselves as better. The last point I would argue is, we're in a world where it's easy to find many, many tools and great things on the internet. If you want to go get tools to manage your health or tools to manage your electricity use in your house, you name it, you can get these great tools. You would think there would be great tools to manage your career, manage your training, assess your skills, figure out where you could get training opportunities in your local labor market. And you would be right to think that those tools exist. You would be wrong to think that they're very good. So most of these tools are run by government labor market assistance organizations. The Department of Labor, for example, has a career one-stop website. I encourage you to go there sometime and take the test. I took the test, and the test is essentially, hey, I lost my job. I'm trying to find out what new opportunities or careers would be good for me to be in. So I put in all my skills that I had, and I got back a blank page that said, I have no skills. I'm qualified for no other occupation. So I took that as a basic thing that I hope the think tank industry does not get disrupted by some Silicon Valley. Because that would be in tough shape. The point of that story is simply to say these systems really are not very good. One of the things, the other thing you could do, I encourage you to go to the Maryland site, for example, and put in that you're interested in getting computer science skills, and you want to know what are the classes or programs in the area. 4,000 results. Why bother? Okay, 4,000 results. It doesn't even have the ability to target into something that I really want. The other thing that some of these sites have, they have links to some other organizations, but they're not very good. There's an organization I found, an Irish organization called Allison. And most of you, or all of you, know what MOOCs are, massively open online courses. Well, Allison provides MOOCs for blue-collar technicians. If you want to learn to be a plumber or an air conditioner repair person or whatever those skills may be, you can take an online MOOC to get there. Now you'd think that would be a pretty good tool that U.S. Department of Labor or other state laborers would want to link to that tool. Not there. So I think fundamentally we should just assume that it's not going to get any better. They've had 15 years to make these things work. I don't believe they're going to make them work. And I think it's time to say we need to have much more robust and deep partnership with the private sector. There's two examples that we found that we really like a lot. I encourage you to look at them. The Markle Foundation's Skillful Initiative, which is a partnership with Microsoft Philanthropies and LinkedIn to develop online tools for workers in Colorado. This is a test bed. If it works, they're going to evaluate. They're going to continue to roll it out. But it's really easy, super friendly, user friendly. It's like going to Amazon and rent a movie or Netflix. Another one is the Council on Adult Experiential Learning, CALE, which is one of the best organizations in the country in this space. They've partnered with companies in the financial services industries in New York, the chemical industry, and others to again create these specialized portals or websites to help workers understand their competencies, what competencies they're lacking, what skills they might need, and how to get jobs in these industries. So let me just conclude with, I think this is one of those things that should receive pretty strong bipartisan support. If you're a Republican and you're worried about sort of the right incentives, you want to get people back in the labor market, and you're also worried about fiscal responsibility, I think the risk for people on the right side of the aisle is if we don't do a better job with these programs, we're going to have workers who are not as productive as they will be, so therefore companies won't be as productive. But more importantly, you're going to see a lot more pressure up here on the Hill to not pass legislation that drives economic growth and innovation. I looked, for example, at the recent bill on autonomous vehicles, where it exempted trucks. Okay, why would it exempt trucks, which is, by the way, the first place we're going to see autonomous vehicles will be in trucks. It exempted trucks because the Teamsters didn't want to lose their jobs. So those are the kinds of pressures that I think are going to be accelerated unless we do a much better job of moving forward with these programs. If you're a Democrat, the risk is that oftentimes, well, we want to just preserve these existing bureaucratic programs. We understand who they are. We have these formula programs that we just want to keep pumping more money into. I think the risk there is that without reform, without real innovation in the space, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, only we'll do a little bit more of it. And I don't think that's going to cut it as we go forward. We're going to need not just more money, but really transform systems. So with that, let me close and I'll turn it over. First, Dad, if you want to use the mic there, that's great.
Great, thanks very much. Is that, no, that's not there. I turned it off. That's right on. Thanks, Rob, and it's great to be here with everybody. This is a fabulous piece of work. I was delighted to read it. My current project, and Susan is working with us on this at the Council on Foreign Relations, is a task force. CFR usually has a couple of these a year, a task force project looking at the future of the U.S. workforce. So very much of this set of issues. It's co-chaired by Ken Pritzker, who was the Secretary of Commerce, and John Engler, who was former Michigan governor, Business Roundtable, NAM. So it's been a great team to work with over the last 9 months or so. Our report's coming out in a couple of months, but it's largely written. And I see lots of overlap with what you've produced here, which is really encouraging. It's funny, oftentimes in the think tank world, we're sort of competitive. We want to come up with something that nobody else has come up with. I think in this space, the need is so enormous that we all need to be focusing on a core set of issues and hopefully pushing in some similar directions. And so I was delighted with this on a couple of levels. I think the analysis on the impact of automation and technology and artificial intelligence is probably as right as it's possible to get. I mean, if you look at the work that Susan and her team have done at McKinsey, or I see Mark Nero here in the audience working on digitization and the economy, I think we're not looking at this mass era of technologically induced unemployment, but I do think we're looking at an economy where people are going to have to develop very different sets of skills and are going to have to be updating and refining those throughout their lives in order to be able to find the good jobs that are going to be created in this new environment. So I was delighted that I think this report focuses on what is absolutely the key issue, which is how to make the link between education, mid-career training on one hand, and the labor market on the other hand much tighter and closer, so that we're educating people for where the labor market is and where it's going. I like the focus here on community colleges, which I think are key in this. Apprenticeships, we have so much to learn from what the Swiss and the Germans are doing, particularly, when you talk about apprenticeships in the United States, people immediately say, well, it's tracking, right? I want my kid to go to college. I don't want my kid to go into an apprenticeship. Well, if you look at Switzerland, 75-80% of the high school kids are going into apprenticeships, and a lot of them go into four-year college. The current head of the big Swiss bank, started as a banking apprentice, and this is quite typical, right? It's not a tracking system. It just gives you career focus early on, and then you can broaden on into four-year college or beyond or whatever you want. I think we have a ton to learn from that. I completely agree with Rob on expanding Pell Grants for career technical education. I think the administration is on board with that. I think a lot of Congress are. A lot of this is going to come up for any of you working on the Higher Education Act reauthorization, so there's a real chance here, I think, to grapple with a lot of these issues. I also like the mentions here of career counseling and navigation assistance. We did an interview for the task force with Brian Geese, who used to work in the Obama administration, running a nonprofit now called Opportunity at Work. And he said basically career counseling is the key for everyone. Wealthier kids have it built in their families, right? They've got this network that they're born into. A lot of other people aren't born into that network, and unless we provide it for them, they're not going to find paths that are going to work for them in their work life. So I like to focus on that. I think there could even be more. Just a handful of kind of small things that I think are challenges. This problem of mid-career retraining is really hard. I mean, we come out in our report more or less where you do on the virtues of the Scandinavian models of relatively low levels of job protection, but a lot of action to help people when they lose their jobs. I think there's no question it's the right way to go. It's expensive, which is a real problem. I mean, it would cost a lot more than what we do now. The other thing is, when you look at trade adjustment assistance, for example, the chapter in my book on trade adjustment assistance is called The Tragedy of Trade Adjustment Assistance. And a lot of that is about the failure of the government to focus on it properly in the way Rob talks about. But the evidence on TAA is sadly still very mixed. I mean, we've never had the kind of long-term studies that we ought to have, but if you do the, individuals who get trade adjustment assistance to individuals who just get the first job back that they possibly can, and you look 4 years out, people who underwent retraining are worse off than the people who went directly back into the labor market. Amy Goldstein's new book, Janesville, about what happened in that community after the disappearance of the car plant there. She actually hired the Upjohn Institute to follow a bunch of the people that she was writing about. Same result. We haven't really figured out how to do mid-career training in a way that's really effective. Some of the stuff in here I like. I think wage insurance is not a bad idea to get people back into the labor market quickly, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, that's a nut that we really have not cracked very well. It gets into this question that Rob also raised, of sort of regional development versus relocation. And I am 100% sympathetic to what Rob talks about. I grew up in Canada where regional development assistance was sort of built into the DNA of the country. But even if you look there, you take the maritime provinces, which were built around the fisheries, and then the cod disappeared, and there was no industry there anymore. And they sort of went through this 30, 40-year transition, and the maritime provinces look reasonably prosperous these days. It's a new economy built around tourism and other things. But the population has shrunk dramatically. A lot of people left. They went to the Alberta oil fields. There just weren't the jobs available. And so I think we really need both. I think, yes, we need targeted regional development assistance. There was some good stuff in the tax bill that I think deserves watching. Real incentives for investors to put money into what have been called distressed communities. There's an organization called the Economic Innovation Group that pushed for that provision in the tax bill. I think all that's very positive, but I also think we do need to look at barriers to mobility. We need to look at the fact that our occupational licensing system, state by state, is being hopelessly ossified, made it very hard for people to move from one state or another to retain their credentials. You look at relocation assistance under trade adjustment, $1,500. How are you going to move from some town in the Midwest to even to Texas or other places where jobs are getting created on $1,500? And I do think zoning infrastructure issues in places where jobs are being created also need to be addressed seriously. So I'd like to see us do both of those. And then finally, probably my biggest critique of this paper is I think it's a bit too focused on the federal government role. I mean, as Rob rightly acknowledges with a number of his examples here, a lot of the innovation in this space has been at the state and local levels. And that is where the labor markets are, after all. They're largely state and local. There have been some tremendous innovations coming out of the philanthropic world. Rob mentions the Markle Foundation's work with LinkedIn and Microsoft in Colorado. They also reference in this paper Credential Engine, which is an effort to try to solve this matching problem. Like what credentials are employers looking for? This is an issue that's just getting off the ground. Business Roundtable's involved. The Illumina Foundation, Jamie Marasotis was on our task force to try to use big data to kind of help grease this problem of what sort of credentials do you need to get into the labor market. There are a lot of really interesting innovations going. I'm not sure that I want to see the Department of Labor take this over and try to create their own database. I would rather see federal government, state government cooperation with a lot of these initiatives. You look at where the best labor market data is these days, not to downplay the importance of BLS, which is tremendously important, and they need more money and they need more support, but a lot of the granular stuff is coming out of Burning Glass or LinkedIn or indeed the private sector companies that are gathering this data. And I also think finally that the private sector is simply going to have to play a much bigger role here. This can't be just a case of federal incentives encouraging companies to do the right thing. Companies are going to have to get far, far more serious about the training. And I'm seeing a lot of good signs. If you look at what AT&T is doing, retraining 300,000 of its employees to work on the new mobile platforms. You look at Toyota's workforce development program, which is a model around the country. Even Walmart is taking this, training their workers up. A lot of it's sort of basic education stuff, but they're realizing the value in this. In my book, I argued very much for a bottoms-up competitive strategy supported but not led by the federal government. I still think that's the right way to go. So I think Rob absolutely identifies all the right problems, but I think we need to engage a larger group of actors here. So let me stop there.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. Susan.
First of all, let me thank you for inviting me today, and congratulations on yet another great ITF report. Rob and I have, I don't know, something of a love fest going on because I routinely cite your speeches and testimony to Congress and your papers. And once again, I think you really nicely crystallized the set of issues. I agree with everything that's been said so far. So rather than bore you with more of the same, I thought I'll just focus on a couple points maybe that deserve more attention. I would first say that since I'm speaking to a room full of people working in the Senate, we must resist efforts to slow down the adoption of automation and AI. I completely agree that the idea of a robot tax is, well, not only unworkable, but is not what we want. So I work at the consulting firm McKinsey & Company, and what we see is that even though there are these great advances in what technology can do for us, so what AI algorithms can do, natural language processing, image recognition, the rate at which companies are actually adopting these new technologies in research we've done has not changed. So companies are made up of people, and people don't like to change, and it's a big CapEx investment, and it requires a huge organizational shift, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that pickup, if anything, has been slow. And so while it may seem convenient to say, well, let's not allow autonomous vehicles, let's slow down the creation and adoption of robotics, that is definitely not the right answer for this economy, because the US has been a leader in productivity and innovation, and we will only maintain our economic dynamism by continuing. So please resist. Second, I thought I'd talk about, well, we're talking about workforce adjustment and skills needed. And I thought I'd share a little bit about the research that we've done about what skills exactly are needed. So we looked at the amount of work that could be automated in the US and in other countries. And we did it by starting with 800 occupations, 2,000 activities. So when you think about your job, you do different things. Sometimes you are sitting here today thinking, absorbing information. Sometimes you're writing emails. Sometimes you're answering questions. So we broke down each occupation into its component tasks and then assessed to what extent can robotics and AI do those tasks. How is that likely to play out in the near term? So when you do that, what you see is that the amount of work that is likely to be automated versus where new jobs are going to come requires a big shift in skills. So by and large, work that can be very heavily automated today falls into three categories. One are any kind of physical manual job in a predictable environment. So manufacturing assembly lines are a classic example, and much of that work over the last 15 years has been automated, and that process will continue. But it will also touch things you might not think of, like fast food cooks, cashiers in retail that are standing there doing the physical work in a very confined space. Second set of jobs that can be very effectively automated today are those that involve a lot of collection and processing of data. So think about mortgage underwriters, accountants, financial analysts, bookkeepers, record keepers. A lot of the back office, white collar America, where when you think about huge companies, you know there are like tens of thousands of people doing something in those buildings and you're not quite sure what it is. Well, a lot of those people are doing some form of basic data collection and processing. And that can be very effectively automated. So those are the jobs going away, but what skills will be needed? Well, the things that machines are not very good at, and I think for the next 15 years, safe to say, will not be very good at, involve a range of both technical skills, but also social and emotional skills. So it's really a combination of, yes, we need to step up tech training. More people need to understand coding and how to use AI algorithms, how to use advanced social media web design, user experience, all these things. But we also need people who can interact with others. So as it turns out, legislatures and psychiatrists are the two least automatable occupations in our study. So that's good news. But things that require interpersonal skills, judgment, compromise, teamwork. So when we think about what sort of workforce training programs should be supported, it's actually complicated. Because on the one hand, we do want more technologists, but we want people that can marry technology skills with judgment, decision-making, interpersonal skills. Now, what does it mean for workforce retraining? I think that when we look back at history, we have not had mass unemployment. And that's because with each new wave of technological change, it has been accompanied, at least so far, by a big step up in education. So when you go back to the agrarian society of the US 100 years ago, there was a movement called the US high school movement, where in 1910, less than 20% of Americans finished high school. Because it just wasn't needed. And as work shifted from agriculture to manufacturing, there was a growing recognition, a bottom-up movement that more students would need to complete high school to work effectively in the industrial society. And not driven by Washington, but just sort of a grassroots movement. In a space of 30 years, you went from very few people completing high school to having it be well over 80%. And then that actually set up the US, as it turns out. This was well ahead of Europe. So I know we always bemoan the state of US education, but 100 years ago, the US workforce was far more educated than the Europeans, led to a great manufacturing boom. And then after World War II, it set up the GI Bill to push a huge number of people to go into post-secondary and tertiary education, specifically college, but also it funded technical degrees. And then that led to the shift from manufacturing to services. So I think today it is not an understatement to say we need a revolution. Now, I don't think is it graduate school? No. But we're going to need some sort of massive step up in rethinking how we educate the workforce. But I don't think it's a matter of more formal years of schooling. I think instead what's been talked about, the short-term worker training, and this concept of lifelong learning, we need to go from being a slogan to being a reality. And that means enabling people mid-career with mortgages and children, can't go to school for 2 years, to have access to short-term, effective training opportunities to build skills. Now maybe that could come through a modified TAA, maybe we call it a TTAA program. It could come from companies. So I'm going to tout a program that McKinsey has started and is now expanded through our philanthropic arm. It's a program called Generation. And our goal is to take 1 million disadvantaged youth around the world and put them through short-term training programs and get them into jobs. So far, it's a new program, and we have placed 16,000 disadvantaged youth. The interesting thing about this program is that there's a job at the end of it. So we collaborate with corporations. They actually pay for the training. And then students apply. And it's a combination of coaching and very targeted, say, 3-month training programs. So in the US, for instance, we train people to be a certified nursing assistant. And we work with hospitals to say, what are the few critical skills you need to get your foot in the door as a CNA? And from there, then they get on-the-job training. And it's been very effective. It does illustrate this huge need, though, of coaching. We're now going to expand this into a program we call regeneration for mid-career people. But I think that this model, it's similar sort of to a coding boot camp. This model of a training program that is a matter of months, not years, to learn the critical skills you need, and then you get your first job and you start a career ladder within the company, I think is critical. I would underscore that I do think that the private sector has a very important role to play. Companies are experimenting with different models. Ed talked about AT&T, which has maybe the most publicized in the US, the largest program. They realized they needed a workforce that had more digital skills than their current workforce has. And so they partnered with Udacity, one of the online educational providers, to allow its employees to earn what they call nano degrees in very specific technical skills, as well as an online master's course with Georgia State University. Other companies, though, realize that there's value in educating the workforce for careers outside the company. So Starbucks enables its baristas to take online courses with Arizona State University to earn college credits, not to stay at Starbucks forever, but to go out and have a career elsewhere. And I think that's realistic, because when we talk about automation, like, think about what's going to happen in banking, all those mortgage underwriters. I mean, we're talking about potentially mass layoffs of people, and it's not feasible for a retail bank to say, well, we'll find new jobs for people within this company. But I think somehow, for companies to take the next step, say, we're going to educate people for their next job outside of our company, would be something that we would want to create incentives for and promote.
Great, thank you. David?
I want to thank Rob and ITF for the opportunity to share our thoughts on the report. And a little selfishly, I want to thank them for the positive tone of the report. I'm the father of a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, and the idea that they're not going to be living in my basement for the rest of their life. The other thing of positive note and a selfish note is my oldest son is a stats minor at the university, so he got excellent coaching from his father, obviously. I want to talk a little bit about P21 in general, which is my organization. You're obviously familiar with McKinsey, less so P21. We're not quite as large or famous. We were founded in 2002 in Washington, D.C. This conversation has been going on for a long time. There was a group called the CEO Roundtable, and it was mostly West Coast multinationals, Oracle, Apple, Cisco, Microsoft. All the CEOs were lamenting the fact that students weren't graduating from high school or college with the skills necessary to be successful. And they groused about this for a significant amount of time. And what they came to understand is they really needed a framework to define what those skills are. And out of that was some seed money came from the companies and from the U.S. Department of Education. My organization was born. We spent the first 5 years sort of coalescing ideas from the corporate sector, from the policy world, the K-12 and higher ed world, and the business world on what those skills were. Our framework came out in 2006. It is not the only framework in existence, but it's one of the oldest and most widely recognized. So I'm going to direct my comments about the report to this concept of skills. And there's a clarification in terms piece that I'll get into that's in a moment that's really important. But I was a sixth grade, I'm a millennial trapped in an old man's body, so I career hop constantly. And when I try to explain what the organization does, I hold my hands up in the shape of a triangle because I taught sixth grade for a long time. We work with federal and state policymakers. We have 19 members of a bipartisan House caucus called the 21st Century Skills Caucus. So we try to, the reauthorization of PERC is the reauthorization of Higher Ed Act or ESEA. We try to get our skills-friendly language into those laws. We also work with the business sector. We're funded by a lot of very large corporations, some small corporations, and some important nonprofits like NEA and AFT, National School Boards Association. We want their ideas to moderate and filter the ideas that come from the business sector. And the final piece, and I'll address the school design and redesign elements of important in this, is we have a network of 96 exemplar programs around the United States, very similar to the Blue Ribbon program, where we try to identify programs, early learning beyond school and in K-12, that put these ideas into practice and produce the skills that this report calls for and other frameworks call for as well. One terminology piece, ESSA, when it was written, specifically calls out for whole child education and socio-emotional learning. That has been in the education world for a very long time, but it's never been codified before. So ESSA provides an extraordinary opportunity, but it also provides a linguistic difficulty. My organization calls them 21st century skills. We're only 18 years into it. We have 82 more years to develop these skills, so we're very comfortable calling them 21st century skills. There are other organizations that call them SEL. In England, they may be called core competencies. I'll be in China on Friday. They're calling them essential competencies as well. So the language may vary, the label may vary from country to country, framework to framework, but we're really talking in essence about learner outcomes. So now about the report itself. One of the things that struck me was this call to focus on high school. And there's been a lot of work around high school redesign since the 90s. And the argument that my organization would make is that's too late to focus on skill building. So when we first formed our exemplar network in 2014, we identified K-12 programs that produce these skills that assess for collaboration, critical thinking, communication, creativity. And we had a metric developed by Johns Hopkins to identify the systemic supports that allow kids to develop these skills in K-12. We got pushback almost immediately because we were hearing from early learning programs in around the United States that these skills needed to be developed before kids enter kindergarten. There is sort of a demographic bump that children like my own get where they have an opportunity to develop these skills at home, not so much for the vast majority of the children around the world. So we started extending the framework down into early learning years. In September, we're a nonprofit, it's all free. We released a report and we extended that framework into kids as young as 18 months old. How do you develop these skills, identify these skills, encourage these skills, create a culture and environment in which these skills can be successful? The next iteration of this as well is in October, November of this year, we're going to extend it again, and we're going to go into what we call the on-school, what normal people call out-of-school time, OSD, is there's opportunities in after-school programs and summer camps and in museum informal learning spaces like in the city, in which students can develop these particular skills. And then the final iteration, probably in 2 years from now, is adult learner outcomes, but the outcomes are the same. So we would argue, and we would push back against the report, in that yes, high school is a crucial place to learn these skills, but it can occur outside of high school. It should occur in informal learning spaces. It should occur in early learning spaces as well. So we would ask that folks think about extending the nexus, the center in which kids learn these particular skills. The other thing that we've been doing a lot of thinking about is the skills themselves. So our framework came out around 2006, 2007. And almost immediately we received pushback saying, oh, you need to add this skill, you need to add that skill. And we're cognizant of that, but I'm a little leery of undertaking redefining 21st century skills in my tenure as a boss at D21. But what I'm worried about is AI in a very specific sense. I think we need to redefine what these particular skills are. And I'll give you a very concrete example. I have an Amazon Echo or Dot or Look in every room of my house. And I've had to change the way I communicate so I can communicate effectively with that machine to get the end result that I want. In the old days, people like me learned to type, and the input-output device was a keyboard. Now it's voice. So our definitions of what it means to communicate have to be adjusted because we're communicating not just with another human being, we're communicating with AI now. And there's different genres of speech and syntax that we have to learn. So that means we have to redefine how we teach it and how we assess it. I look at my youngest son, he wants to be a graphic artist. But you look at what some of the larger corporations are doing in terms of creativity, is you're creating in conjunction with AI now. There's software that writes music, there's software that writes poetry. I was a former newspaper editor, and there's software that writes news stories now. How do we be creative in the design process with AI? So creativity is one of our core skills, is what does it mean to be creative from a design perspective when AI might iterate on designs, and they might be beautiful and thoughtful, but they're totally unusable for a human being, and you need a human to interface with that. My wife's a hospital executive. I think in this report, if not the McKinsey report, they cited a beautiful example of what AI and human collaboration looks like in the sense of pathologists can identify 92% of breast cell if there's breast cancer. If humans do 96%. AI is doing 92%, but when you combine humans with AI, 99.5% is of identification. So what does it mean to be a collaborator when you're no longer collaborating just with a human, you're collaborating with AI as well. So these core skills that are in everyone's framework, I think we need to readjust because there is no longer, these skills were always thought of as human to human skills. They're not just human to human skills anymore. They are human to human, human to machine, human to human, and machine skills. So there needs to be a readjustment. So my organization has a lot of work to do, and I would welcome anybody that wants to help us with it. The other thing that I would focus on as well is this idea of a pedagogy that supports the learning. I've been asked to wrap up and talk too long already. So a pedagogy in the changing of the cultures of the project-based learning guide. And the final piece, I'll conclude with a very short story. I worked for years with the Ohio Resource Center when I had my own consulting business, and I was at a trades meeting in Columbus, and I was approached by the gentleman who ran the carpentry union in Ohio. He said, Dave, we've got the best carpenters in the world in Ohio. I don't need more carpenters. We can produce these carpenters. Unless you can give me a carpenter who can create, can collaborate, can communicate, and be a problem solver. Those are the kind of carpenters that I'm looking for. So as we think about the skill development or the redesign of the policies, is think of a DNA double helix. We have to meld the content or discipline or domain knowledge with the skill building, and they occur in unison. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Excuse me. People in my profession always say I'm going to use my teacher voice, but I don't really have one, so I need to pull the mic up. I also want to thank ITIF for this paper. This is a bit out of my sphere, which I think is a problem right there that we talk to our educators so many times about, making sure that they really understand economic development and that they're thinking ahead. So I'd love to keep this connection going, and we actually have Rob speaking at our National Policy Seminar next week, so hopefully you can continue to do that. My field, well, I should start. Our membership is about 25,000 folks who are teaching career and technical programs, who are both in high schools, post-secondary, and also more and more, we're talking about the middle and elementary grades as well. So I would really approach the paper from that perspective and just speak about a few things that relate to education. And I'm not an expert on a lot of the other topics, but I'm glad again that this type of thought process is taking place so we can be thinking more proactively about the future. I also want to thank you for the positive outlook. I was looking at a commercial yesterday with the robot dogs, and I can't believe how lifelike they are. And I do hear quite a bit when I'm out speaking to our state conferences from people who are fearing that their jobs are going to be replaced or that things are going to be automated. And I think you put in a sense of realism about where we really are. One thing I will say is that ACTE as an organization has always thought that education needs to change with the times. We need to reflect what's taking place in the economy. And we view this as the next wave and think that education will be there to support and serve in that capacity. So we look forward to that. I was also looking last night at the 10 jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago. So things like app developer, social media manager, driverless car engineer, which we've talked about earlier today, are examples, I think, of where there are places where the economy will change, but there will be jobs. And part of our issue within career and technical education, and I think education as a whole, is trying to get our folks to think about those changes that take place. I will admit that even within certain parts of our profession, we have people holding on to sectors, but sometimes there are reasons for that. And I'll give you an example. We had, I was on a school visit in Miami-Dade about a year ago, and I won't mention the program, but it's a program that many people talk about as one that should be leaving schools, and really isn't, there's not a place for it. And when I asked the administrator why the program was still in place, her answer was, if I got rid of this, my community would be in an uproar. So I think there's a lot of education and training that we need to provide to parents and those in the community as well about these changes that are taking place. And that's a lot of what teachers have to respond to in addition to the daily tasks. So just wanted to put that out there. I do have a few things, I guess themes from the paper that I picked up on that I wanted to reference. One is that education needs to better connect to employment sectors. We wholeheartedly believe that at ACTE, and we talk a lot about that issue. There's a number of activities we're currently undertaking to try to get our educators thinking more about alignment. One is a career pavilion that we do at our conference to bring in trade organizations and other industries talking about what issues are changing their skill needs, what the schools we need to think about. We have a blog that does that as well, and we're starting industry tours this month or next month, I guess, to take our educators to see what some of these changes are about. So we really want them to be educated as well. And I think that issue of professional development and ongoing learning, teacher externships, those types of initiatives need to be thought about. I know your paper was primarily focused on the post-secondary side, but I'm mentioning some of these secondary issues because I think they do relate. And we discussed, I know a few of the speakers have discussed the importance of career development and exploration. We think that's critical. We think we've got to get our students thinking much earlier about careers, beginning in elementary school, starting to explore them. And then as you go through that trajectory of education, getting towards post-secondary, you're going to get more specific. But I do think, I guess one concern I have is making sure that we're not going too specific too early. Because we do, as educators, we're trying to instill in our students the knowledge and skills that they'll need to succeed in a career, not just an occupation. So if you're in a high school 9th grade course and you've got an industry coming in and trying to teach very specific skills, not to say that some of that won't occur in the high school place, but we've got to think about that balance. And that's a tug and pull that we're having within education and trying to identify where is the proper balance. Another issue that I would mention is that our board of directors has really taken a position that you do need to look at the student's career pathway, which is a structured course or structured really pathway made up of courses looking at the end goal of those credentials that are meaningful in the workplace. And that, like the paper says, maybe there's an overabundance of geometry. Geometry may be terrific if you're going into the construction field or architecture field, but not for other fields. And so we need to look at that balance for individual students as well. What are the appropriate courses that are going to lead them to a fulfilling career as they graduate? Another issue, obviously addressed in the paper, is on higher education and credentialing. I like the fact that we were mentioning things like credentials engine. We do believe that the landscape is terribly confusing for students and parents out there, as well as teachers, not knowing which credentials really have meaning. We do believe that we're going to be moving towards, I guess, shorter term credentials. We've read the research on that, and we're seeing it happening in many of our community and technical colleges. So we think that that will be an expansion and continue to grow. But we want to make sure that there's a transparency in terms of the weight of those credentials and the value of those credentials. And that's where business and industry can do a lot to help. We think when business and industry is involved, such as the National Association of Manufacturing and the Manufacturing Council, those types of industries do have better understanding and value in those credentials because they work together to really identify and define what the field needs in terms of entering in employment and how you move up through a career lattice. So we would encourage more industries to do that. And I guess my last point would just be, I mentioned career development. I also think we need more support in general for workforce and for this connection in earlier grades. You know, we're looking right now at the Perkins reauthorization, which is the Carl D. Perkins Career Tech Act, which is currently up for reauthorization in Congress. And our bill has not received any additional funding since 2007. In fact, it's been cut in real terms. So if we really want to grow this, we need to focus more on the elementary and the secondary level, as well as the post-secondary level, ensuring that students really have true career development and exploration, and that they have career pathways that are developed with counselors and others that lead to those meaningful credentials. I'm going to stop there because I know we're short on time, but happy to answer questions.
Okay, well, thank you. So you should think about any questions, John. Let me just spend 2 minutes kind of responding to some of the points. I want to start with Ted's point about TAA, about the tragedy of TAA. I think when you look at those studies, they're a little more complicated than answers. Number one, they show that the workers that have the hardest time are older workers, which makes sense. Younger workers have to actually do okay in TAA. And secondly, I don't know why we'd expect any different outcome in a place like Janesville, where there's no other jobs, you know. So the idea that somehow training is a substitute for a good job creation, I think is a fallacy. We shouldn't expect it is. Training has to be based upon having a strong economy in a region. When we lose a large number of manufacturing jobs, which tend to pay 10 to 15% more per educational level, particularly for blue-collar workers, why would we not expect workers to go to lower wage jobs? That just was the answer. The question is, can you meld those two things together? Ted, you talked about other roles, other institutions. I couldn't agree more. This won't be solved by Washington, but I also would argue it won't be solved without Washington. You look at the states, for example. I used to work for a governor. One of the main things states want is they want to keep costs as low as possible. So they have strong incentives out there to invest in these areas, particularly in unemployment insurance. The only way to sort of get that level playing field, if you will, is through federal action. The same thing with the private sector in a little bit different ways. There are these what you could call system interdependencies. One of the things I think we need to do is we need to separate out education and credentialing. Many jobs that employers apply to, that employers, including the federal government, will put a BA requirement or BS requirement just because they can. There's no reason to do that. Many jobs don't actually require a BA. It's a factual thing. So if you do it, I do it, everybody does it, and everybody has to go get a BA. One way to fix that would be to encourage federal government to encourage businesses to stop doing that. So there's a big publisher in New York, I'm blanking on their name now, they just changed that about a month ago or so, where they said, we're no longer going to require BA degrees for many of the jobs that we have here. Now, for, authors or, super, yeah, sure. But for many jobs, we're going to allow alternative kinds of certificates. That process becomes a lot easier if everybody jumps off the bridge together. And my point is, these are areas where the federal government can help, number one, by having OPM stop requiring BAs for federal jobs where you don't really need a BA. And number two, working in partnership with industry on some of these things. Secondly, I think on a lot of these institutional things, I mentioned one of the roles would be for the federal government to encourage philanthropic organizations to have a commitment to transform or create in each state one new technical college, like they did in Pennsylvania. Again, that's sort of a system-wide effort. The problem I see is we get all these one-offs, great programs like AT&T or the IBM, we get one-offs, and one-offs aren't going to cut it. It needs systemic change over it, and that does require, I think, more of a partnership kind of thinking. And I couldn't agree more, by the way, on the data point. I absolutely have to work with partners on that, which is sort of one of my main points on this is we really need to, but again, I think the key there is the federal government needs to be a catalyst and a supporter of some of that. These systems have to have certain characteristics. Number one, they can't just be for Colorado or a nation. They got to be for the entire nation. They can't just be for one narrow set of occupation. They need to be for everybody. So there's a sense of universality there that I think is important to push. So why don't I just stop there? We'll open up for questions or comments or suggestions. You want to just raise your hand and then identify. Well, I don't think we have mics, do we? So maybe just speak loudly and say who we are first.
Sure. David Barnes from IBM. Firstly, congratulations on the report. It has a lot of the things that we're also pursuing in the skills and workforce space, and it's good to see that it aligns with both the OECD work and McKinsey work in this space too. Firstly, we have jumped off the bridge in terms of not requiring a four-year college degree for a bunch of jobs in our company in areas like cloud and security and so on. So these are contemporary jobs, and we call them blue-collar jobs rather than blue-collar or white-collar. I'd also comment that there is an opportunity to use the technology to better plan or manage workers in job-to-job transitions. In other words, keeping them from having to fall into the social safety net. Because with the cognitive or AI systems and predictive analytics, we're starting to work on identifying individual employees whose kind of career path is at risk because of technology and market trends and data that we have. So we can then kind of talk to them about moving either onto a different path in the company or moving into a path where they get assistance to transition to a job outside of the company. And we couldn't do that without the technology, obviously. So that's just an opportunity which I think companies can exploit, but also public employment services in countries and communities where those organizations exist could be applying that kind of model.
Is this through Watson?
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, almost like you can go on the credit reporting system and get a credit score. You ought to be able to get a sort of employment sustainability score.
Rob, can I ask you a question? Actually, good to see you, David. David was very helpful in the work that we did as well. How do How do you talk to an employee about this if you think that their job is going to disappear within the company and you're trying to sell them on a transition out? I mean, it seems to me a lot of companies would say, well, why are we wasting our time if we're going to lose this employee? Isn't it going to be bad for morale if we tell people early that their job's probably going to disappear? How do you kind of sell that in your environment? How do you think other companies should do it?
Look, I think there's a bit of a sea change in employee attitudes. I mean, they value transparency and truth over a sudden nasty shock, right? We are also invested heavily in our employee skills, $500 million a year. And again, that's AI-supported learning. So it adjusts for technology changes, company priority changes, but it also measures the employee's propensity to learn, their success, and impact on the business results, etc. So we can tell the employee, hey, look, you're really good in this space, or we can say that, you know, retraining in this space might be difficult, and there are these opportunities outside, so that you're kind of opening the aperture for them. I mean, not everyone's going to react well, obviously, but the point is you're saying to them that if you sit still and do nothing, you know, the future is not as bright as you might think it is.
Can I have a quick, so I'm fascinated also by this, because this is a big issue companies are grappling with. So as they consider we can automate, say you're a bank, lots of jobs, they immediately think, well, what do we do with those people? And so it sounds to me like you're saying some people would be retrained and redirected to different careers, and some you decide will exit. Did I hear that right? And if so, can you give us any sense of what proportion of people retrain and redirect to a different career versus exit the company?
This is something we've started piloting. It's too early for data, like success or failure data yet. You know, we've only had a couple thousand people through this process. So, you know, in about 12 months we'll be ready to talk about it some more.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why OPM, for example, couldn't adopt a system like that.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, the role being would be to beta test, validate, be a model for other both state governments, local governments, and other private organizations. Other questions? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Britt Sand, the Democratic Coalition for Congress and Hines. So we've been looking at this a lot ourselves. We have a Future of Work Task Force, and one of the main questions that keeps coming up is kind of the responsibility of the employer in this. Sarah, you spoke a bit about how some of the companies that you're working with actually pay for students to go through the programs. There's also models like in Rhode Island, there's a mixture of both the state is paying for it as well as nonprofits. Just wondering like what your thoughts are on scalability of companies actually making the investments themselves, because especially as you look at the expansion of contingent workforce, you know, that kind of gets tricky.
So I can start with it just quickly. It all sounds great, you know, we all think it's a wonderful thing, and we can all point to some best practice examples of exemplar companies. When you look at the actual aggregate data, it's a very different story. And what you find is that something between 2000 and 2014-ish area, the amount of money that U.S. companies or companies in the U.S. have invested in training their workers has declined by 35% as a share of GDP. Companies are spending less, not more, as a group. And the reason they're doing that is because, I think, for two reasons. They face credible short-term pressures from equity markets. You say you're going to start a new training program, the stock market certainly doesn't reward you. And secondly, worker turnover or tenure has the tenure's gone down slightly and turnover's gone up. And so why invest in those assets when they're going to walk out the door before you can have a direction investment? So that's not to say that companies can't play a key role. I believe they can. And to get a system, you have to have a system where they're playing a key role. It's just, I don't think we can just assume that they're going to do it on their own. You know, in Europe, I asked the CEO of a Siemens division here, $2 billion Siemens division. I had dinner with one, and I said, how come you guys put all this money and do it here? And he goes, well, I'll tell you a story. In Europe, if we didn't invest in the training and apprenticeship program as Siemens, we would be socially shunned in the business community. Businesses would look at us and go, Siemens. He goes, here in the U.S., if I don't invest in the United way, I'm shunned. But if I free ride on skills, nobody cares or notices. And I think that's a big difference, is there is an expectation in some of these other countries that employers have to do it. Here, there's no expectation. You can get away with free riding very, very easily. And it's hard to change that, so.
Well, okay, let me be more optimistic.
I would.
Corporate trading spending has gone down. And part of that is a bit of a mystery. We can see the aggregate data, but when you ask any individual company, are you spending less, they say no, so we're not quite sure what's going on there. But I think that we are at a different era. So I've been in Washington for 20 years, working with American business and European business. And in Europe, it's quite simple. The unions and the social expectations mean that there aren't mass layoffs, or where there can be mass layoffs in Scandinavia, you have these worker jobs councils that are funded by the employer. So as a payroll tax, the companies pay into a private fund called, in Sweden, they're called the worker jobs councils. And then if you have to lay someone off, they immediately go to this jobs council and they get hands-on coaching and information about where can they take training programs, where are their job openings. So I think that it can work. The shift that I've seen in the last 2 years in the US, though, is really amazing. So we don't have strong unions, as we know. And American business has been much more laissez-faire. But the number of companies talking about what are we going to do to ensure that people have career opportunities is striking. I think that there is an opportunity for a social movement to really have companies step up almost for a good housekeeping seal of approval to say, we're investing in workforce training, or even if we lay people off, we're going to provide them with short-term training to get into other careers. So I think that we are at a unique moment, and maybe it's because TAA failed, and maybe it's because we had some electoral surprises that many companies and CEOs are saying, we need to make sure that the next wave of potential job losses is going to go differently than the last wave since 2000 with opening up trade to China.
I just quickly add, we talked about the Swedish program in the report, but also there's a really interesting UK program that has been partly funded by government through a nonprofit, but it's an effort to get companies and other organizations to commit to becoming a high-performance training company. And it appears to be very successful just because of sort of peer pressure. Oh, how come everybody wants to be green and leads and all that stuff, but there's no sort of, again, there's no signal that you're really, like IBM, really good at this. Where's the signal? Well, you can talk about it, but there's no outside signal. This UK program actually institutionalizes that signal, and it encourages CEOs and human resource officers wanting to get that, if you will. Ted, did you want to come?
No, that's fine.
We have time for maybe 2 questions. Why don't we ask both questions at once?
Real quickly, the question is, have you studied the correlation between youth unemployment and the social skills development programs? Because wouldn't that make hiring more people more expensive? You have to train the ones you have to retain them or to redirect them. And is there a correlation between youth unemployment? Because I think it's very high.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah, right here. So we'll go through you here and then here. Right there. Next one.
Me?
You. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, currently, I mean, even though we have the skills gap kind of narrative and productivity is decreasing, all wage stagnation, all these kind of things, the corporate profits continue to rise. And so I'm wondering, do we see a point where, this automation issue and the lack of workers are going to be filling new jobs, will that actually begin to impact corporate profits to the degree that they might actually perhaps take the initiative to invest in worker retraining? Because I mean, the reason that corporations won't necessarily be leading the charge to worker to these kind of training programs by themselves is because they're currently not really getting hurt by them in the bottom line kind of area. So
Okay. Thank you. And then right here.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that came up in response to the last question, but thinking about the relative success of the Nordic adjustment model, to what extent do you think American organized labor could play a role in the actual provision of some of these adjustment programs like retraining or career plans?
Okay. not an attempt for our report to boil the ocean and fix the entire institution. It's more about adults. So I didn't really look at sort of the failure of K-12 and youth unemployment. I don't know if anybody has comments on that. Maybe Steve, you want to comment on that? Mike, please.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch, I'm not familiar with the word you're talking about.
Okay, it's fine if you don't want to. Just think about youth unemployment and why that is, how that's a barrier to employing youth without the skills these companies have to pay.
Right, well, I definitely think there's a huge youth unemployment issue. We've not looked at the correlation issue. I think that would be something interesting to do, to see if there is a connection there. I mean, I think I guess I don't have enough knowledge to really answer your question effectively. Love to explore it more.
Okay. Sorry, so the second question about why don't companies do this because it makes sense. Well, I think it doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. The same reason why economists have done an enormous amount of studies on company investment in R&D. It's pretty much 100% in agreement. Companies underinvest in research and development. Not only for the society, but for themselves. And the reason is because they can't capture all the returns. These returns spill over, other companies get the benefits. And so we invest about half of what we should in the United States on R&D to maximize social output. That's why we have the R&D tax credit, other programs like that. I think the same thing is exactly true with skills. It's an externality. Training, you're providing a value that goes to society as well as to your own firm, and therefore companies underinvest in that. And then you have the time horizon too. You know, these companies that have to earn, IBM looking at, even a company like IBM is looking at quarterly returns, quarterly profits. And so when you put all those together, I do think that you end up with underinvestment from companies.
Can I just respond quickly to that, Rob? Because I'm a bit more with Susan on this, and I do think it actually gets back to the point you kind of glossed over in your talk is very important. A full employment economy helps a lot of things. So if you look, for instance, at the retail sector now, you're suddenly seeing retailers pay a heck of a lot more attention to this. I mean, Costco was kind of the first to say, look, we really need to pay people better to try to retain them. They're having a heck of a time in a lot of the retail sector of retaining employees. This is why Walmart is upping its training and its wages. This is why Starbucks has been increasing various benefits. When you've got a full employment economy, it does begin to really trickle down and have some very positive effects at the lower end of the labor market. And we are seeing that, and I hope that we'll retain the strong economy for some time, because it does make a difference. We saw it at the end of the 90s as well, when this really kicked in. I do think on the training piece, there's a narrative that I think companies are starting to get, which is big companies plan everything in their supply chains, right? You know, they know down to the last screw, where it's come from, when it's coming. The one thing they don't, the most important thing in their operation, which is their people, their employees. They're purchasing it on the spot market, in effect. We've got this job open, we'll advertise it, people will send in resumes, and we'll see what we end up with. It's a very illogical way to staff any sort of organization. And I think more and more companies are really getting that, including kind of smaller manufacturers who are just screaming for people with the skills they need. And suddenly they're looking at, should we be working with the career and technical educator folks? And can we cooperate with the community colleges? Again, full employment is a great grease for this, because it puts this kind of challenge on companies. But I am a lot more optimistic that some of the market failure problem you described is actually going to be solved by the companies themselves.
I would agree. I would also make a plug though for a tax credit for human capital development. We have an R&D tax credit. We have had a big tax overhaul. Unfortunately, credit for human capital investment was not part of it, but why not give companies and other institutions tax credits for developing the human capital in their workforce?
Yeah, we've been long supporters of that. I didn't put it in this report because no way Congress is going to revisit corporate tax reform anytime in the near future. But absolutely, the proposal we've had is to expand the R&D tax credit into a nominal tax credit. We can cover both expenditures.
And I just wanted to add, we actually are seeing a lot of industry interest of late. I know the National Retail Federation just launched a new campaign around their workforce issues. The New Skills for New Youth campaign that the JP Morgan Chase has put millions really into an initiative to focus on this issue of skills And there's lots of industries who are coming to our door. So I think it is starting to move.
So before we close, I just want to quickly respond to the later one. I wouldn't presume to speak for AFL-CIO. I do know, though, that the AFL-CIO and other affiliates have been among the leaders in the U.S. on these industry labor cooperative partnerships. For example, in Las Vegas with hotels and hotel workers, communications workers are really one of the leaders in there. So I think one of the challenges, though, is to move more to these kinds of systems where organized labor can play a role. We need to have more flexibility and reform in the government part of that system, particularly with the WIBs. A lot of that money gets into the WIBs and never comes out into these more flexible partnerships that a local labor union could do with a corporate or set of corporate partners. So I do think there's some opportunity there. Okay, with that, I apologize, we've gone over about 5 minutes. I do want to thank everybody for your attention and for coming, and please join me in thanking a terrific panelists.